We have Amy Dye-Reeves. The program is called Improving Conversation, Assisting Hard of Hearing and Visual Impairments. Okay. In the summer of 2019, Amy Dye-Reeves began the Associate Education Librarian position at Texas Tech University. Previously, Amy had held the position of Assistant Professor of Research and Instruction for the Humanities at Murray State University. In May of 2019, Amy won the Innovators Award from the University of Tennessee, Knoxville, School of Information Science program. In 2018, Amy was selected to participate for the Wikipedia Education Fellowship Program. Presently, Amy is a certified library media specialist from the state of Tennessee with 5 years of educational instruction and leadership. Amy holds a BA and MA in history from East Tennessee State University. Additionally, Amy holds an MS in information science from the University of Tennessee, Knoxville. I hope you enjoyed today's meeting. Take it away, Amy. And we will have questions after the presentation. I'm just admitting some more people to the group. And you're also welcome to put questions in the chat.
All right, so good morning, everybody. I'm going to go ahead and take a second and share my screen with you, if you will bear with me momentarily. Okay, so hopefully you are going to see my screen here in a second. And so the conversation that we're having today is about assisting hard of hearing and as well as visual impairments, like working with patrons. And so one of the things that I'm going to start out with quite quickly is just, like I said, my name is Amy Dye-Reeves. Here's my email address. I currently work at Texas Tech University in Lubbock, Texas, so West Texas, and I'm the education librarian there. So during the presentation, it is an interactive presentation. And so I have a Jamboard. And so with the Jamboard, all you would do is you can either scan the QR code or there's one that's on the screen here as well. What you would do is it's going to have a Jamboard where all you do is you can ask either questions or even provide resources to other people who are in the presentation on things that they've also learned or things they know about that particular topic. So just kind of think about that throughout the presentation. I'm going to go ahead and go to our next screen. So when we first start working out with our patrons, you want to start to learn about what is hard of hearing. What does that mean? So we kind of start with that definition. It's really a person who is not able to hear as well as somebody else with normal hearing. And so that really, it's really works with hearing loss, for example. And that can be mild, it can be moderate, it can be severe. It really affects them. And really, as you can see on the screen, that people do really, when they have hearing loss, they can benefit that from hearing aids. So you might see a patron who would have hearing aids. And they also have implants as well as other types of assistive devices as well as captioning. So when you think about these things, right here, and they do use often sign language. So here's some more information about what that is. If you want to find out, there's a link on the screen in front of you. How we're defining working with visual impairments. So this is kind of the information that I have recently is really what it classifies what visual impairments is. It's into two different groups. It's, distance as well as vision impairments. There's mild, there's moderate, there's severe, there's other blindness, as well as other visual type impairments. So when you're working with somebody, you have to kind of think of these things in mind and who they are and what is being defined as hard of hearing as well as visual impairments. So oftentimes people will ask me, what's the difference between deaf and hard of hearing? And the community is often really diverse in that. So when you're working with that, that can be, age level, education background, communication methods, cultural identity, that can all play into part on what deaf and hard of hearing in that community. So when you're working with people, you have to really think about who they are and what is going to be the most inclusive and efficient way to work with them, because within your community groups, it may not be just, having someone who is, age level and ability level, and say that they are just in college or graduate school. You might have someone in your library who happens to bring one of their children who is deaf and hard of hearing, or also has a visual impairment. So it's important to keep those things in mind and what they're also calling themselves, so that way you can be as inclusive as possible. So some of the strategies that I like to talk about when working with hearing impaired patrons. So really, to get their attention, you want to make sure that how are they going to feel the most comfortable within your university library, or even your public library, maybe even your school library. And also, looking at them, directly. And, a lot of times you'll have an interpreter with them, but if you don't, what are some ways that I can make them feel comfortable, right? So you want to make eye contact with them, especially the ones who are that hard of hearing, and making sure that you're not looking away or constantly looking at the computer, but you're actually focusing on them as individuals. And it's really, listening to some of the cues that you kind of know about these type of patron populations, and just making sure that it's not exaggerated, you're not speaking too loud or speaking too slowly, but you're making sure that they have what they need. And so getting those attention is really important to them. So I see some chats in there too. I'm not sure if people have any questions.
Morning, Amy.
Yes.
The Jamboard, did you want people to be able to write on it?
Yes. Yeah, they should be able to have access to that.
Right now, they're saying it's view only.
Oh, it's view only. Okay, so I'll have to, do you want me to go ahead and fix that now? Or just go ahead with the presentation?
When it's best for you.
Okay, yeah, so when we get towards the end, we'll have some time, and I'll make sure I'll fix that really quickly. For some reason, it was showing mine was fine, but if you have any questions up until then, if you could go ahead and just put that into chat, and then towards the end, I'll have that Jamboard ready as well. So
no problem.
Yeah, thank you all so much. All right, I apologize for that technical glitch. All right, so moving right along. So when you're working with hearing impaired patrons, using those short sentences, as well as to repeat, rephrase that, spell words if they're not understood, making sure that the patron will understand what you're saying to them in plain language. Oftentimes I know that when we're working with them that, writing something back or writing it down, I use a program often that's similar to Word to kind of add to that clarification if they have any questions, especially if I don't have somebody who is a interpreter with me. Instant messaging is also really helpful, as well as your chat services, so they can type that information in. I work with graduate students who are in the College of Education, and to kind of give a little bit of background, we have a hard of hearing and visual impairments in a certification program. So I work with them quite often, and I have students who are actually graduating today, and because graduation is happening on our campus, who is actually hard of hearing, and I've worked with them throughout his whole dissertation process, and now he's going to be an adjunct faculty over there in our College of Education. And so working with that particular individual throughout the whole process and showing them how to find databases and resources has been something that I've had to learn quite a bit to figure out what works best for them, what I can say to them that would be helpful but not overwhelming, and still showing them where and how to access the university library's resources. It's really important that we get the help that we need, especially when we're training people to provide that information. It's that active listening. So oftentimes when I am working with one of my students in particular that I've been working with for 4 years, I've had to really think in terms of, okay, so when I'm working with them, what is the most efficient way to work with that particular individual? So what is it that they are wanting to find for resources? Because, when you're working with someone who can see what you see in front of you in the screen, it's going to be completely different for someone who is visual impairments or hard of hearing. So I have to, constantly remember that in mind, especially with my research guides that I have for people who are visually impaired. For example, I made all my research guides ADA compliant. But it's important that when you're working with these patrons, that you meet them at their point of need, and placing the items where they can be easily seen is really important too, that they know where to find the information, especially having a orientation to the library, not just for your freshmen or say students who are like graduate students, but thinking, about working with your disability offices. And so making sure that you have a time for them to come into the library, that, maybe the summer is the best time, because we are getting into summer, to start having some of these orientations, to work with someone who is a interpreter or other people from the disability offices. So that way they can help that person, if you're not available, to kind of walk them through some of these resources or things that are available to kind of train them so they can also help as well. One thing that I like to always make sure is that I'm not making assumptions about this particular group. And visual impairments always doesn't mean that it's a total loss of vision. It can be, and that it doesn't affect only people who are seniors, for example. Visual impairment does look different for every single person, so it's not going to be always the same. They may not use a cane, they may not always have a service dog or wear those dark glasses as well. So it's important to be inclusive. So everyone's going to look a little bit differently. So when you're interacting with your patrons, you want to make sure that you keep accessibility in mind, especially with those marketing campaigns. You want to make sure that you have a set of colors, especially when you go on Google. You can actually say that I'm looking for ADA compliant colors. I do that with my research guides, and making sure that it's not too overwhelming, or the fact that they can't see it, the content, and also making sure that you don't have so much content that it's going to be really hard for them to view that material. Because you think about this, that when you have your research guides, that someone who has, say, a visual impairment, for example, they would have to hear every single thing that is on your research guide in connection with JAWS. Yeah. So they will be hearing that information there. And so when they're doing that, they'll hear every single word that is happening. And so making sure that it's precise, making sure that you're not just having complete videos all the time, that even if you do have some of those videos, make sure that we'll talk more about that it is compliant, does have closed captioning, making sure that they have that information that they need. And so that we're not just putting words that are on our research guides just to be putting them on there, but making sure that it's mindful and that it's to the point and they get the information that they need. And it's definitely important with marketing campaigns because we do like to use a lot of color. We do like to get inviting patrons to come to our programming, but keep that in mind, especially when you have different types of patrons, because they may not be able to see what someone else would see. So keeping your audience mindful is really important. Same thing, just talking about that thinking and acting inclusive, making sure that you do work with somebody in a marketing campaign, accessibility to your library building, providing those resources. And that really shows and it really goes a long way, especially for your patrons, because if they can't find what they're looking for, or they didn't have a positive time within your university libraries, they're less likely to work with your resources. So you want to make sure that things are easily navigated, that they can actually walk them through, like say the stacks, if it's too close, it may be hard for them to navigate that. Also think about in terms of just, your desks. I've worked with a project that was a couple of years ago, really in the midst of COVID, that when we worked with our research hub, for example, and our study hub, making sure that was ADA compliant, making sure someone with a wheelchair would be able to, have a desk that was ADA compliant, making sure that's not too high and not too low, making sure that it's easy for them to come into the library and want to be there and that they can see themselves there is really important. Making sure that things are not so cluttered on your shelves. Oftentimes when we're, throughout the year, we get really busy. It might be hard to, on our shelves there's books everywhere. They could be on the floor. They could be, you know, scattered on that shelf. So just making sure that that is going to be accessible is really important, because someone who is visually impaired, it can, you know, that can really trigger them in a lot of ways. So making sure that it is in precise where it needs to be. There might also be poor lighting, and so that can also be a factor as well. So making sure that you do have the correct lighting that's soft enough that doesn't bother them. When we're working with our marketing campaigns, like I said, is just making sure that all of our catalogs, our calendars, databases, everything is accessible for someone who has these type of visual impairments. What I like to do is, when I am working with these visual and strategies with the visual impaired patrons, is making sure they have that large print for the flyers, bookmarks, and I always try to resist that temptation that I want to fit more information in there. And I always think about what size font it should be. Oftentimes I work with at least 14-point font, or maybe just a little bit bigger as well. But make sure that you have, when you're planning these book events or book clubs or one programs, that you're selecting a book that is also audio, because you do want to include that as well. Some of the books, electronic books that we have, are not always accessible. And so making sure that there is an audio version of that, or they can hear that, is really important, because you do want to include them in all of your programming efforts. Making sure that when you're communicating who is deaf and hard of hearing in a library, in the setting, some individuals, again, will identify themselves as deaf or hard of hearing immediately, and will let you know that, and others, some cases, they will not. And what you want to do, if the individual, and I've seen this time and time again with working with students, and is if they tilt the head towards you when they're speaking, you know, you kind of be able to just list, you know, get those cues when you see it. Communication styles are very different. Some people will use sign language. Some will read your lips. So that way you're making sure that you are saying words that, and do it slowly. Some of them might have that assistive listening devices. It really depends on how they're wanting to communicate and collaborate. Being very patient with them and careful to the attention that they need, and making sure that that's regardless of anything that you've heard before, that you are being mindful to what they really need and focusing on that. I rely a lot on the cues of communication and making sure that everyone has the best possible information that they need at that time. I oftentimes will choose a location that is going to be well lit. And sometimes it does help with the outer service desk that we do have the lighting that we need. And sometimes if your library is not like that, but make sure that it is a place where it's well lit. Avoid standing with your back to any light source. That can be a triggering moment for them. Look directly at the person who's talking. Also avoid if there's other conversations that's happening, printers, loud noises, move to another location. Because that's really going to help that particular person, especially with working with someone who is deaf, because you want to focus on them. You want to give all your attention on them. When I am working with patrons, I often will say, you know, sir, ma'am, you know, that way. That's what I normally would do with them, or other inclusive pronouns that would work. Depends on what they prefer, and you can ask them in that conversation. Tapping his, her, or a shoulder or arm, waving your hand, but not frantically, making sure that they're looking at you and tapping on the counter, and just kind of making sure that they kind of know what they need. Avoid those eating, drinking, or chewing while talking, speaking naturally, not too loud, not too slowly, just getting them in mind. In the reference interview, when I'm working with patrons, I watch for language or even things that might be differences in terms of literacy. I like to repeat the question back to the user in writing if necessary. So that way I am understanding what they need. Using the short, direct sentences, using simple language, avoiding any unnecessary words that might not be important to that conversation. Writing those important words down as you speak and keeping that paper in clear view where they are. Following up to make sure the question has been answered, because you don't want them to walk away feeling frustrated. You don't want them to feel that you don't care about them. You want to make sure that when you're working with them, that they are getting what they need in the time that they're needed. And I've also worked in groups with students as well, and really looking at the best location possible to satisfy those needs, using the visual aids. If it's not with a visual impairments, more of our deaf and hard of hearing, allowing them to look at that before you end up starting any type of group work. And especially if you're giving a group instructional session, making sure that you write those instructions and those handouts and working with your disability office to do so, repeating those questions at least, twice to make sure that people are getting what they need from the audience members, especially if they're not hearing what someone else had said, making sure to repeat that, put that on the screen as well, and using some of these hands-on activities, but also having someone there to also help in addition to yourself. Working with an interpreter, I often work with them, and when I work with them, that I want to make sure that I set up a program and also working with that faculty member if it's a instruction session. And just, being aware there is different types of interpreting. So working with that disability office and asking it is what they do. And if they have any other insights to working with that particular patron, what would be really helpful. And I like to schedule this at least 2 weeks in advance to my instruction session or my programming. That can be up to 2 months in advance for programming efforts, and making sure that they will be there, that they will attend to the schedule, and that they know that there's someone who has that particular need. Providing those copies of handouts is really important, making sure there's not any technical errors or jargon before the program begins. And I also like to give breaks to the person who is the interpreter in the program. So they'll have, maybe 10 minutes with not just them, but the group setting. So that way that they will have, adequate time to have a break. That person can ask the interpreter questions as well, but everyone will get a break because they need a break. And some of these programs can be very long, it can be very taxing. So it's important to make sure that they get the breaks they need as well. Making sure you have that lighting, what their preference is before that even begins there. Some of the resources that I like to kind of show with working with blind patrons, I use a smartphone apps, and I'll also give kind of link to the PowerPoint, so you can kind of click on these resources as well. And I'll be sure to send that out to you all. There's a National Library Service for the blind and print, and that's disabled. If you're looking for a free Braille and audiobooks and library service, that is going to be one that I feel that is really great in terms of if you're looking for that. If your budget doesn't allow you to have some of these resources, this is a great resource to go to. The American Council of the Blind offers additional resources on employment services and peer support travel resources, especially if you have a patron who is looking for these things, or networking or membership resources. I also like to really find some of these Braille books that are free. And that is something that I'm currently working on within our university libraries. Being that I'm the liaison for education, I'm currently working on a Braille collection for children's books. And that has been a really passionate project that I have right now. So finding some of these Braille and free resources have been really ideal for me, especially if you are working with that type of population. So here's some additional resources. BrailleWorks does a wonderful job as well. So some more strategies to help them. I just like to, ask them constantly, how may I help you? Making sure, I also really make sure that our reference desk is about 2 feet at 3 o'clock from where you're facing. I really think that's really important, because that way they have enough distance, and that they know, where the desk is. That's very important. And again, it's the having those low vision, that signage, high contrast, making sure that to identify yourself and who you are, and what your role is in the library so that they know, and making sure that you don't leave a blind person talking to an empty chair, that you really announce your comings and goings, And so they don't feel alone and they don't, feel scared. So making sure that's really important. I work with a lot of visual impairments with patrons who are materials and assistive technology. And so if you're doing a lot of collection development, some of the things that I look at is making sure we have our large print books and magazines that the typeface is greater than 14. That's kind of what I am looking at right now. Braille books and magazines, making you have a tactile graphics. That can also be on loan. I've seen that from the National Library Service for the blind and physically handicapped. And we're going to talk about collection development in the next few slides. But also making sure that Braille readers can also enjoy that together. Audio is really important. You've got to make sure you have audio for a lot of your ebooks, making sure that you can have accessive technology there. The ones that I like to talk about with resources, these I think will help you as well if you're trying to build that collection. Bookshare, it's really accessible for people who can't read from a standard print. There is a registration fee for that. For people who are not, like students aren't qualified in United States schools. It's really geared towards the United States, but if you're from a different country, they'll have information on that website as well. But Bookshare works amazing. One of the ones I also want to highlight is the National Library Service for the Blind and Print Disabled, because I have really looked at this extensively about having more information, like I said, for Braille and visual impairments, but Braille in particular, because I'm working on that project. Visual impairments is going to come second for me, but that's really helped me tremendously. Learning Ally is really a nonprofit organization that provides programming and technology to help students or even patrons with print disabilities, blindness, visual impairments, and especially if they might have dyslexia, for example. Also some resources that for you to be aware of for print and Braille and book resources, some low cost efforts here, especially at the top, looking for programming, storybooks, things that might be digital talking book players for purchase, NLS. And also there is a Bard Mobile that I kind of look at sometimes that has to do with like App Store and for Android and iOS, and also looking at the accessible mobile reading apps that will be there as well. More collection development opportunities here, because one of the things that I am looking at, and it might be for you as well, is putting a SWOT analysis and really looking at your patron population and working with people who are on campus to identify what percentage of your patrons might have a visual impairment or might have who can't see as well for blindness purposes. So when you're thinking about that, make sure that if you're making a justification for your collection development, what is your population that you're trying to target, as well as getting training is really going to be very key. That's something I've worked with this past year. But with our resources, there's a lot of resources out there, especially for collection development. And this is really targets technology on this particular slide. A lot of it has some like workplace information and like independent living products that'll be helpful, especially with technology is concerned, and making sure that captioning and for audio description is very helpful as well. One of them that I work with currently is games and software for children, because we do have children who come into our university libraries, and making sure that we do have things that are accessible for them. Gentle Wind has been great for those award-winning books for children. One of them I also like is Family Connect. They have a Braille book that really teaches children about Braille to encourage literacy for all levels. That might be something to kind of help with as well there. One thing I like is really thinking about the impairments and a toy guide for them, because again, if your library is like a curriculum materials center, or maybe you just have a section in your library for working with these students or patrons, that this would be really helpful, because it's early childhood development items are ones that are really going to be great. These large type, these tactile maps, these globes, these puzzles, all of this, the American Printing House for the Blind has some great resources there for you to use. I also like to look at science products for the blind, because we are currently working with all of our students. They might be in STEM education, and they're wanting to learn more about ways to work with students who are in schools, depending on what you're needing. But they have light sensors, talking calculators, magnifying glass, telescopes, but the science products for the blind is really, really helpful as well. And I have another additional resources from ACB, which is really working with the blind on those materials. Technology, that is something that we work with every single day, that we know that when we're working with our students or our patrons, that what are some of the things that I've worked with that might also help you all. I also look at Recite Me, so Zoom text software. So Recite is a cloud-based accessibility solution, which allows them to have a text-to-speech functionality. Dyslexia software that's included with that. They have a translation tool for over 100 languages, which I have found really helpful. And also it does with font size, color, reading aloud, and language as well. I also use something that is called Zoom Text that really helps to magnify with the optional screen reading and applications, email and the internet, for example. If you kind of click on this, and I'll find, like I said, I'll send this email PowerPoint out to you all, but Freedom Scientific has some really good products on Zoom Text there. And also one thing I like to talk about is creating QR games, code games for visual impairments and for patrons. One of the things that I looked at this past summer, when we had our orientations coming in for our freshmen, I like to talk about a little bit scenario, is when we started working last summer with a gaming opportunity for our freshmen coming into the university, one of the first things that I thought about was accessibility, making sure that someone would be able to participate into this type of program. We knew we wanted to use QR codes for the game. We wanted to post them around the library so they could go from point one, say one point to another and scan them. And then eventually it would lead them back to the service desk to where they could pick up their prize. But before we could even really kind of start some of these things, and this particular project was I wanted to look at people with screen readers, making sure that they could be able to access that information, especially because we had patrons, not just who were students, but also for parents and grandparents, people who are working with them. So they want to make sure it's all inclusive for every single person who walked through our doors. Sometimes they may not always be aware that the QR code is present and independently. People with low vision may benefit by not having to copy out the large website URLs into the browser. So just remembering that in detail. They may not be aware of that. So that's something that you want to first tackle and to locate that independently. What I like to think about is looking at considerations with graphical codes. And so it's the WCAG. I work with that quite a bit. Thinking about non-text content. If the QR code is being used as a link, there's text alternatives, images as well. They may not always include that text in the image of the QR code. The non-text contrast is really important because people who need those visual recognition, as well as the graphics, is a QR code in order to scan that. Making sure that the colors they use for the squares has color contrast ratio. We talked about that at the top of the presentation, making sure that all those backgrounds are not going to conflict with the way that they're looking at things. And those link purpose, making sure that it's all going to be redirected and where it's going to be redirected to. Using those inclusive design principles, providing those comparable experiences to ensure that the text alternatives and presenting those QR codes, that they are accurately describe the purpose of that code and where it's going to be redirected, and making sure the feedback on the mobile device indicates that the action is in progress or is being completed too. And just don't assume that people will understand how to interact with those QR codes. So providing those step-by-step directions is really going to help people who have those visual impairments who are also blind, to ensure the contrast, again, is the rest of the content is really great. And so they can recognize that code and interact with that. Making sure that in a physical space, consider the height and the location so that people with wheelchairs or restrictive growth can reach them. Make sure that you don't have things that are like a bright sunshiny type colors that will affect them in some way. So making sure that all of that information will be provided. Being consistent and giving them control for usage and positioning of QR codes is consistent. On platforms that support that zooming in, ensure that the QR codes will increase as expected, and making sure it is, again, in plain language that they can understand what it is that is happening. Offer choice to them. For people who can't or do not want to use the QR code, give them a choice to ensure that's always another accessible way to get that information. So providing a URL that the user can enter themselves, or providing an interactive link or a login form or something else that is alternative to that will be really helpful. Prioritize that content and making sure it is large enough to be scanned from a distance. So wherever the user will be interacting with that material, keeping that short and focused. That is the key to that. Adding value, designing those access points for content and forms that need to be signed in. All of that is going to be important when you're navigating, especially using that on different accessible devices. I use a QR code for like requirements. There is a QR code generator from multiple sources or Sprout QR that report that size for QR codes. So it's really 2 centimeters by 2 centimeters, but the QR code as large as they need that, as long as the pixels don't become blurred. And that you're not interrupting anything on the display of that image. I like to also, as you can see on the screen, I use Sprout QR all the time, as well as ScanNova. And there's also information about on the screen in front of you about 40 different versions of QR codes, what's going to be useful, what's not going to be useful, and what can be ADA compliant, and how many characters they are in squares, and making sure that it's not difficult to scan, but that still can be present if you're using any type of graphic that is within, like say you have a dinosaur or something that is on your QR code, making sure that that's accessible there. Freely available resources are the ones that are in front of you. There's the Helen Keller's Services for the Blind, National Association of Blind Students, if you're working with that particular group for students on campus, and also adaptive training with the Associated Service for the Blind and Visual Impairments there. Here's some other additional resources that might be helpful to you all. Just communicating with people who are deaf or hard of hearing, some of their research that they have conducted, and making sure they have some great tips up here at the top. And then there's ones about the Friends of the Library for Deaf Action, if you just want to know more about how to work with that particular population, as well as resources. I use Seedling, as well as the Braille. Like I said, that's a priority for me right now with collection development, is working through those efforts to make sure our collection is accessible. Access World is one that I also look at for accessibility and technology and media access there. And I'm going to go ahead, and as you kind of have some questions, I'm going to work on this Jamboard really quickly. And that is the end of my PowerPoint presentation. And you did have my contact information. Let's share my screen and share it real fast again to show you where that content is. If you have any information for me, this is my email address. It's just amy.dye and then -reeves@ttu.edu. I'm going to go ahead and get that Jamboard really quickly if you have questions, but go ahead and ask those for me if you do, so I can get that Jamboard working for you, because I'm not sure why it wasn't working before. So we'll get that really quickly. No worries there. All right. Anybody have any questions while I'm getting this set up? I know there's a lot of information to go at one time too, as well. Go ahead and get that going.
How did you get involved in this topic and these initiatives? Where did you start with it?
So one of the things how I got initially involved with this particular initiative is, I'm going to go ahead and put this in the chat for everybody. And sorry, I'm just getting that Jamboard, so that way hopefully will be available there. And so I'm going to go ahead and share that. Sorry, do it one time. But how I was getting involved with that in particular is I had a patron who, first of all, who was visually impaired, had never worked with someone like that before. And so I thought, okay, to myself, how am I going to work with this particular patron? And I didn't know how to. And so I worked with our disabilities office to get more information about assistive like technologies, how to work with them. And so through that process, I started working with someone in the disability office to get training, and also looking at collection development for resources, what they would be able to access. Also having children who are blind who come through our university libraries. I want to be able to have a section for them. One of the things that I love to tell a quick story about is I had a patron and there's a little girl and I remember her in particular, and she's like was going around and with the parent, and she saw that we had Harry Potter in Braille, and she was crying. She was so happy. She was like, "Oh, there's a book for me. I can't believe it. I've wanted to read this for so long. This is for me." And she was so happy and so excited. So that's something that I want to continue to build and grow. But also we have blind and visual impairments certifications at our university. So I wanted to support those programs as well as in addition to supporting with our patrons.
Wow. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Thank you for asking that question.
Can you put the slide deck link into the chat as well?
Yes, I actually have it. That is on my PowerPoint, so I'm gonna be able to share that. Give me 1 second.
Yeah, at a certain point, we are here until 11.
Okay.
People have more questions for Amy. Please either put them in the chat or just ask or raise your your digital hand or your regular hand.
For new questions that they might have, because I want to spend some time too to get those questions, because I knew it was a lot of resources here too. On our Jamboard, and really what it is I can kind of share my screen with that in a second, and I'll get the slide deck as well. Let me go ahead and share my screen so we can see the Jamboard. Okay. So this is what my Jamboard really essentially looks like. It is for any questions. You can make that bigger. As well resources and things that might be helpful. Any resources you might have used right here for blind patrons, or any other resources for visual impairments that you have also used that may not have been included in the presentation that we should explore, or any questions or concerns that you have about the presentation. So that's kind of what the Jamboard is, to also reconnect you all. And so you have that link so we can kind of share those things with other people who are wanting to find that information there. But that is what our Jamboard is for essentially free to ask questions or share resources. And I can also work on getting that slide deck here in a minute. I have a PowerPoint presentation, so it's not in Google Slides. So I just got to figure out a good way to kind of put that in there for you. Any other questions so far that you guys would have while I'm kind of working on that, the slide deck?
What did you find was like the hardest adjustment or change you had to make?
So one of the hard adjustments that I had, especially with working with this particular population, if I was talking too fast, because I was very excited to work with them, was making sure that I talked slowly and that I had a purpose and that I was direct with them, and to making sure that they weren't scared or nervous to come to the desk due to their disability. I wanted to make sure that they had the resources that they needed, or the point of contact that would be really useful for them, making sure that they could ask a without just feeling that I wasn't going to be helpful to them, or that I wasn't willing to help them in any way, that I was going to be able to talk with them in a way that was useful. So I just got the slides, and I'm going to go ahead and share that with you really quickly. so that way you can get that slide deck. Okay, so hopefully this works right here because I just uploaded that to Google Slides so that way you can kind of see that. Let me see. Okay, and Smith said that it still is in view only. Mine says the link, anybody with a link can see the Jamboard, so I'm not sure why. So I did that again. I unclicked it, so hopefully that one works. And you can see hopefully the PowerPoint. I just made it anybody with a link can access that. So hopefully you see those two things. I think one of the questions was, how'd you get other departments to work with you? And so one of the, for me to begin with, we do have a visual and impairments program within the College of Education. So that was a natural fit for me to kind of start with that connection. Also, it was really important for me to work with our disabilities office and also to identify what other places on campus have worked with people who are blind and also have either visual impairments or anything else they might would have that I need to know. And once I kind of identified that and worked with the disabilities office, contacting them and how they've worked with them has been really important for like the workflow, because I identified, you know, maybe the English department has worked with this particular group quite a bit. How do they work with them? And how can we, you know, work with other people who are on campus to provide these resources? Because I do book clubs that are on campus here. So I want to make sure that before that we select a book, that it is going to be ADA accessible. I think that is really important, or it doesn't have too many pictures or things that they can't view. And we also have alternatives to that. If you want this particular item, what are some alternatives if it's not going to be accessible? And so I had to work with different departments, the English department, the history department, and others at Honors College on campus to ensure that everything that we are selecting is selected by that criteria of ADA compliance. I think that's going to be important every single time. So hopefully that kind of helps with really that question as well. I'm going to go through the chat and see if I see anything else that somebody would have that I ended up accidentally not saying. Yeah, thank you. Hopefully that kind of helps too with you all. I don't know if I see anything else. Okay, so I had the resources. Hopefully you all got that link to, I'm not here asking about the slides, and I just shared that with you all. So hopefully you're able to see the slide as well as the link to the Jamboard is in there. So hopefully that one works. And the Jamboard, I made sure hopefully that is accessible with everybody. So I apologize for that delay in that. So what other questions do you all have for me? And again, feel free to, you know, unmute, type it in chat, or ask those questions on the Jamboard, or provide any other resources that we didn't talk about that we might need to consider when we're developing a collection or looking at technologies or anything that you would need for instruction. Maybe you have questions about collection development or anything that you would need when working with this patron population.
So for your collection development, did you, I was going to say, with well, I guess with the budget, getting the budget, but because you have the other department, I was thinking it'd be easy, or it became easier or something with for collection.
Yeah, so with collection development, what I did is I did an analysis on that particular department, because we do have a department as well as a certification program for that, and working with them on finding the resources that they looked at our resources, provided information on what they have seen, what's helpful, what's not helpful. But I think for someone starting out who doesn't have that particular, say, background or has that department at their university, just doing a SWOT analysis, working with your disability services, even within if you have a College of Education, asking if there's, you know, visual impairments, hard of hearing, working with those two, I think starting out initially, especially disability services, to identify that and say, what are some of the resources that they have told you that we would need in terms of even technology. And going kind of from there with your collection development, is there a greater need to create a Braille collection? And if you do create the Braille collection, because it can be expensive, but also some of the free resources that you saw on our slides is people are going to use it. And how are they going to use it? And I also like to do assessment as well to figure out, was it accessible to them, asking them, when they come into the library, or working with disability services and saying, did they like these resources? I want to do a survey. What are some, ways to kind of get them involved with the surveys? And so that way I can capture the percentage wise. And so budget wise, I'll be able to make a justification for getting more Braille resources or other things that they would need. So that way we can be inclusive on all levels.
So for interviews, does anyone else have any questions? I'm just trying to think of questions to get you guys talking. But so are you the only faculty member that works with this special community, or all the faculty? Did you all have like a training session for the other faculty members in the library?
So with trainings, what I constantly do is work with our disability services so that they will have trainings to that every semester and know before the semester starts how to work with this patron population, having people come from our College of Education and our faculty, as well as disability services. And training for our student assistants so they know how to work with people who are blind and visual impairments is really important too. Making sure that when they come through the door, that we know how to work with them, that we don't, say, oh no, we can't help you. We know how to help you through the trainings that are provided through the university. That's why I strongly, recommend that people work with any disability services that they can, so that way they can have those initial conversations. What are some of the first things that I need to tackle when working with this population? What are some of the things that I need to know for them to be successful? And then they start coming up and saying, well, this is what you need to work on. These are some resources. Let's, work together, especially if you have someone who is a interpreter, because I have those for my classes, making sure 2 weeks in advance for instruction sessions, up to 2 months for if it's going to be like a book club, making sure that for me, I have the faculty that I work with that has really great insights. If you have faculty that, or say that they have an interest, or that is their research interest, or work with them, definitely targeting them and asking them some of these questions will be another good starting point for them. But just having those conversations initially with them, what are some ways for me to get involved with this patron population, so that way they can see themselves in the library and not be afraid to come and ask questions, or they're afraid that things that are on the shelf are too cluttered, and they're afraid that things are going to fall on them, and they can't access the information that they need. And making sure that your shelving is not too close together. And so that way that can be an issue, especially if they're either have a wheelchair or their cane and going through the shelving, and then they don't have enough room, especially, or if they have a service dog. What if your shelving is too close together? Then they can't access that information too, can also be an issue. Just kind of going through that, people who are in your building, so building services, making sure that you do have enough room for ADA compliancy, because again, you want them to constantly come to the library and use your resources. And so that way they feel included just as anyone else is.
Very good. Anyone else have questions or anything you'd like to share? Your presentation.
Oh, thank you.
Say it again, Julie.
Oh, I wasn't saying anything. I was thinking that this was an amazing presentation, actually, just chock full of information. Thank you.
Yes, it was very good. And I didn't realize that there was a free resource for the Braille books and things. So that's wonderful. Absolutely wonderful. It's 10:54. Oh, does anybody write onto the Jamboard? Do we have to check?
I don't see any questions or concerns. But if you have any questions or concerns, I'm going to keep the Jamboard open. So that way, if you do, I will answer your questions there, as well as any additional resources that you think that we might need to consider that I didn't talk about today. And I'll also put on the Jamboard my contact information. So you'll see that in just a minute if you have any more questions for me.
Okay, can you, by any chance in the chat, do you have a link to your slides?
Oh yeah, they're there. Yeah.
Because I only see the Jamboard one.
I will. Yeah, there. I'll repost.
Thank you. Yeah, because I just see the Jamboard.
Yeah. Okay,
Yeah.
they're at the bottom now.
Thank you. All right. Very good.
I
Please
have
get a link. Sorry, go ahead, Julia.
I have one last question. Is there anything that you'd like to do that hasn't been done yet in this regard?
That is, one of those things that I'm constantly thinking ahead is more about really with technology as it kind of progresses, especially with chat GPT. And I'm really wanting to work on research about how that's going to work with the blind and as well as visual impairments and how they're going to be able to interpret some of that information correctly. I've looked at Bard currently, that is through Google, and they have a lot of text, it's very text heavy. And I'm really going to wonder about, accessibility wise, if this is too much information for them. And also, they also don't provide a link to where they got the information from. So I'm really interested for the future, not only that for information literacy and validity, but also how that's going to be with accessibility in terms of if they had this product going forward. So it's Bard, it's B-A-R-D within Google. And it's something that they are currently testing that has to do with similar to chat GPT. So that's the kind of their product that they're working on. I'm interested to see what that's going to be with disabilities for the future, and if it's going to be able to be accessible for all people. I'm currently investigating that, and I'm hoping that it's going to be accessible, but also for information literacy, that it's important for us to know where our information comes from. So that's kind of on the forefront for me right now, as well as the Braille collection that I'm currently working on.
Oh, cool. Yeah.
All right. Well, it's the last 3 minutes. If there's anyone have any questions, or I want to thank you, Amy. This is really great.
Yay.
Thank you all so much for having me. I appreciate it. And I hope that this was helpful to you all.
Very helpful. Amazing. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Okay. Calling last questions. All right. Well, everyone have a great night, a great day. Enjoy the rest of LACUNY.
And we'll see you at the next session.
Thank you all.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.